Well, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings to you folks on the DVD program. It's good to be able to be with you as well. You know, to most people, the Bible is a very complicated book. Very, very difficult to understand. I remember growing up, I thought I knew what was in the Bible. And I thought I knew what was in the Bible because that's what the preacher said. That's what Mom and Dad thought. That's what Grandma thought and Grandpa thought. And their grandma and their grandpa. What they thought and what they'd been taught, they passed on down through the centuries. And so I thought that I knew what was in the Bible. But then as time passed, I began to read and I began to study, and I began to see that I really didn't know what was in the Bible at all. Now, there are reasons for that, and I find it fascinating sometimes because I run into people that were just like I was, and you probably have too. If you start trying to explain something in the Bible, say, let's take one that's very common. Like when you die, you don't go to heaven. And you try to explain that to someone, and they're just like I was, taught all that time that when you die, that's where you go to heaven. And that's the hope that they have, and that's what they believe. But when you start trying to explain to them that the Bible doesn't say that at all, and you start quoting scriptures to them, it says, no man has ascended into the heavens, and they'll argue with you, and they'll get angry with you, and they'll break their friendship off with you, and they're not students of the Bible at all. They just have learned it through the years, and it's so embedded in their minds that that's what they think and that's what they believe. And some of you folks out there may be the same way. So there are a lot of reasons why people don't understand the Bible. And one of the reasons that they don't understand it is because a lot of the Bible is written in symbolism. And if you don't understand the symbolism and what the symbols represent, then you're not going to get the true meaning out of what God is trying to get across to you. For instance, I'm going to give you a couple of expressions here, or terms, and see if you know what they mean. The Scripture speaks of on the wings of an eagle. Well, we know what an eagle is. An eagle flies in the air. But we read back in the book of Exodus where when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, God took them to Mount Sinai on the wings of an eagle. Now I've heard people try to say that that was in an airplane. Well, they didn't have airplanes back in those days. So what the wings of an eagle represents is God's protection and God watching over you on the wings of an eagle. Now let's look at another one. If you ever read the book of Revelation and you did not understand the symbolism, you probably said, as many religious leaders have said, well, you can't understand the book of Revelation, so don't bother to read it. Well, you can understand it. Let's take what we read in Revelation, the 6th chapter. Revelation, the 6th chapter, it talks about these 7 seals. And it talks about a white horse, a red horse, a black horse, and a pale horse. Well, what does that represent? What does that mean? What do those horses mean? Well, they represent something that Christ explained back in Matthew, the 24th chapter, Mark, the 13th chapter, and Luke, the 21st chapter. Go back and read it. Christ said the first thing says to watch out for false ministers, false prophets. And that's what the white horse represents, false ministers. Then he went on to the red horse, and after that he said some of the signs of the times of the end was going to be that there would be wars and rumors of wars. Well, the red horse symbolizes war because there's a lot of bloodshed in war. Then going on to the black horse and the pale horse, he proceeded to say that after the war that there would be famine, pestilence, and disease. So you see, you have to understand what these horses represent, so understand what message God is trying to convey to us. Also, when you or in the book of Revelation, you may read about the woes. In one particular section, in Revelation 8:13, it says, there are woe, woe, woe. He's talking about 3 woes. But what are those woes? Well, we understand there are plagues that's going to be poured out upon mankind. And the last 3 of the 7 is woes, the 3 woes. So you have to understand that those are plagues. And what is meant by take up your cross and follow me? Christ said it. He says, you must take up your cross and follow me. Well, it means that whatever you have to do to enter into God's kingdom, you do it. It's not going to be everything a rosy road for you. It's not going to be a rose garden, as they say. It's going to be some difficult times ahead. But whatever is necessary to enter into God's kingdom, you do it. And let's do one more. What is meant by you can't put new wine in old bottles? It says the old bottles will leak the wine. Well, it means that once God calls you and you come into the knowledge of the truth, you can't combine your old way of life with your new. You have to become a new creature in Christ and forget the old. So that's what those symbols represent. So that's just a few of them. The list absolutely goes on and on and on. But in order to understand the Bible, as I said, you have to understand the symbolism. Now I want to take another one, and I'm going to elaborate on this symbol that I'm going to be giving to you here and show you how it works. Now, before coming up here, I went over and got me a cup of water. And I brought this cup of water up here, and if you can see it, it's half full of water. Well, some people look at this cup, they say, oh, that cup's half full, which it is. And then some people look at it and say, oh, no, it's half empty, which it is. So when we look at it and say it's half full, this is looking at your optimistic side. When it's half empty, you're looking at the pessimistic side. Let's take an example of that. You go to the Feast of Tabernacles, and you save your second tithes. So about halfway through the feast, you start counting up your money. And you say, I've used half of my money. Now the optimist will say, I don't have much time left. I've got to take some people out to dinner and share this money with them. Now the one who says his glass is half empty, he's the pessimist, and he starts counting his money. He says, man, I got to be careful. I got to save this money for myself and my family, and I don't have time to spend it on anybody else. So you see, there's lessons that you can learn from the Bible. Now, I'll use that as an analogy because I use this cup as an analogy because there's a lot of things we can learn from a cup. Now, cups, I brought another kind of cup up here. This is a different kind of cup. This is a coffee cup. It's got a smiley face on it, but it too holds ingredients. So I want to continue on with this cup symbolism a little bit. I looked this word cup up in the Strong's Concordance, and here's what it says. Now don't expect any unusual explanations of the word cup, because you probably know what it means. But in the Greek, the word is poterion. It's spelled P-O-T-E-R-I-O-N. It means a drinking vessel, as I showed you. It had water in it. Now, by extension, carrying on that definition out a little further, it also means not only a cup, but its contents, what's in that cup. In this case, it's water. And I use this cup trying to teach a lesson as far as that goes. And a further extension of the definition, it means fate. One's fate, from the word cup. Now, I looked it up in the Hebrew, in the Old Testament, and it means pretty much the same thing. So we look at the word cup. It's a vessel. that holds something. And it also can mean by the contents of what's in it. A cup, a drinking vessel. Now, I was in a thrift store yesterday, looking around. I like to go to thrift stores. I just like to get a bargain. I like to get a deal. And somehow, when I go into a thrift store, I go through these aisles, and I came to this aisle where they had all these glasses and the cups and bowls. And I looked at them, and they had all shapes and all sizes and all colors of these cups. And I know my daughter buys her daughter cups, and it all has these wonderful sayings on them about you're beautiful, or you can do what you want to do, you can accomplish anything in life. And I have a lot of these cups. I remember getting a cup on my 50th birthday. Somebody gave me a cup and it had 50th written on it. And then somebody gave me one that had black balloons on it for some reason. But, you know, you can get these cups that have all kind of things on them. And they're made out of different materials. Now, I showed you two here today. This one cup is made out of plastic. The other cup is made out of paper. Hard paper, it's not leaking and everything, but you can also get them made out of wood. I've seen pottery made out of clay. So you can get these different cups, but they're made for special reasons. They hold water or tea or coffee. I used to like cappuccino, and I don't know, what are you, tomato juice? You can put different things in these cups. Now let's notice an example about a cup in the Bible. Let's go to Psalm 23. Have you ever heard that one before? Psalm 23. In Psalm 23, I'm going to read it first. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for my name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me," as Mr. Taylor mentioned in his sermonette. "I will never leave you nor forsake you," he said. "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So what we see here, David starts off by saying, "The Lord is my shepherd." Well, he was talking about something he was familiar with, because David in his early years was a shepherd. So he understood what a shepherd's responsibility was in taking care of the sheep. And many times the symbolism in the Bible refers to God's people as sheep, and he and the ministry as shepherds. So he said, the words David uses here for God is my shepherd comes from his own life experiences that he's had, because he had been, as I said, a shepherd from his youth. Now, as far as sheep are concerned, in verse 2, any disturbance or intruder scares sheep. They must be antsy little creatures, like a lot of us are. They're very fearful animals, and they cannot lie down unless they feel totally secure. So David says he can lie down because he feels totally secure. And in green pastures, David used this eloquent language to express his view of the abundant care God gives to his people. Can you imagine a sheep or a cow or a horse or any grass-eating creature, and you turn him loose in this great big field? It would be like paradise. He's got everything he needs. He just wanders around munching all day long, not a care in the world. Tail flapping, knocking the flies away, looking up every now and then, snort a little bit or moo or whatever a cow and a horse does, but at peace. And still waters, sheep are afraid of fast-flowing streams. God's provision of still waters has a soothing effect, and it calms the sheep. So many times when we're going through the trials and the tests, if we can just get to the Bible and start reading some of these scriptures that give us hope and comfort, it's kind of like lying down beside still waters. It sort of takes some of the sting away. He restores my soul. God refreshes His people with His quiet voice and gentle touch. For this reason, the sheep know the shepherd and are known by Him. We read that in John the 10th chapter. He says, my sheep know my voice. And He knows His sheep. Now in verse 20, and in 23 verse 4, in the valley of the shadow of death, can refer to any distressing time in our lives. The awareness of our own mortality often comes with sickness, trials, and hardship. And sometimes we may be to the point in our lives with some of our sicknesses and diseases or accidents where we may think or thought that we were going to die. But David says, it doesn't matter though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He said, I don't fear that evil. I don't have any problems. Now let's look at a couple examples. Hold your finger right there in Psalm 23, and let's go to Psalm 31. Let's understand why and what David is talking about here. In Psalm 31, let's read in verse 9. David cries out, have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am in trouble. My eyes waste away with grief, yes, my soul and my body. For my life is spent with grief, and my years with sighing. My strength fails because of my iniquity, and my bones are wasting away. I am a reproach among all my enemies, but especially among my neighbors. Even his neighbors were upset with him and not like him for some reason, and am repulsive to my acquaintances. Those who see me outside flee from me. I am forgotten like a dead man, out of mind. I'm like a broken vessel. And what good is a broken cup? For I hear the slander of many. Fear is on every side. While they take counsel together against me, they scheme to take my life away. And David, in so many of the Psalms, is crying out to God for deliverance. There's others where he says, my body is filled with inflammation. He says, I've got sores all over me and they're just filled with pus. And he says, my life is ebbing away. And so David is constantly crying out to God to deliver him. Now keep your finger on Psalm 23. Now go to Psalm 116. Psalm 116. And verse 1. Psalm 116 and verse 1. Now David writes this psalm, I love the Lord because He has heard my voice and my supplications. Because He has inclined His ear to me, therefore I will call upon Him as long as I live. So God answered his prayer. The pains of death surrounded me, and the pangs of Sheol, or the grave, laid hold of me. I found trouble and sorrow. Then I called upon the name of the Eternal. O Lord, I implore you, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord, and righteous. Yes, our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple, and that means the innocent. I was brought low, and He saved me. Return to your rest, O my soul, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with me, or with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, and my feet from falling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. So He gave him his life back. So now we begin to understand why David says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I don't fear any evil, because I know my Lord, my God is with me. And he says, His rod and His staff, they comfort me. Now, the rod and the staff, ancient shepherds used the rod and the staff to rescue, to protect, and to guide the sheep. Thus, they become symbols of the good shepherd's loving care over his flock. The sheep are not alone. Their shepherd is standing over them, guiding them in safety, just as the Lord stands over us and protects us. Now he goes on and says, you prepared a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. What does he mean there? Well, hold your finger there and let's go to Psalm 103. Psalm 103. And notice what David is saying. Verse 1, Psalm 103, verse 1. He says, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless His holy name. And forget not all His benefits, who forgives all of our iniquities and heals all your diseases. Who redeems your life from destruction, who crowns you with loving kindness and tender mercies, who satisfies your mouth with good things, so that your mouth is renewed like the eagles. So when he says, You prepared a table before me. David is thinking about all the blessings that God is giving. What a bounty. It's like those sheep that were out in that green pastures. Well, for David, he's thinking about all the blessings that God has given us. And that's what we need to be thinking about. But then he goes on and says, my cup runs over. So David's cup wasn't half full, it wasn't half empty. It was completely running over with blessings that God had given to him. And he says, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. He was saying, my life is completely filled with blessings. And I know that you're going to continue to be with me as long as I live. And he says, I'm looking forward to dwelling in the house of the Lord forever. So he had his face and his life projected toward God's kingdom. So we see here the cup is running over. And the cup that's running over, by extension, the definition is the contents of the cup. David's cup, his life, was just filled with blessings. So we can see the analogy here of what David's talking about. Let's go to another example over in Matthew, the 23rd chapter. Matthew 23 and verse 25. Another example of a cup. Here Christ is having to give a scathing rebuke to the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes and Pharisees were the hypocrites of their day. They professed themselves to be religious leaders and keeping every word of God to the point that they were above all the other people. They were much better than the common people. And Christ confronted them, and in one situation he used this analogy in verse 25. He said, woe to you. Here's an example of a woe, which is a warning. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and the dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. When I was reading this, I was thinking about one time my granddaughter took a cup of something up to her room to drink. And she forgot that it was up there. It was probably some coffee or something. She likes some coffee or cappuccino. And she left it up there, and by the time I went up to get it, and I looked inside that cup, it was a real dark stench like, which had mold growing on it. Now the outside of the cup was still okay. But when I looked at the inside of that cup, it was in need of cleansing. And so Grandpa had to take it downstairs and try to pour out the contents and clean it out. Now, Mark elaborated on this same principle over in Mark the 7th chapter. Mark 7. And here's the lesson that we are to learn if once we understand the analogy of the cup. Mark 7, verse 14. When he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. So here, Christ is in a teaching moment. And he's going to tell them some things that they need to know, because you see, the people of that day, anytime they went out to the shambles or downtown into the marketplace, and they even came close to any of the Gentiles, they had to come home and wash their hands all the way up to the elbows because they were unclean. And they were scared that if they, whatever they did, they had to be clean. They wanted the outside to look real good. And Christ said, there's nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him. But the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. I know one time, and it's possible in God's church from time to time that you go out to a restaurant and you may, God forbid, eat something that has pork in it. Or maybe something that has white sugar in it. Or something that is not too good for your body. Well, you're not supposed to do that all the time, of course. But there are times that you do eat those things. And believe me, eventually it will come out the draft. That's just the way the body works. But it won't kill you. But what Christ is saying here, he went on in verse 17, when he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. What do you mean? You see, they'd grown up in that other culture where you couldn't rub shoulders with the Gentiles or else you'd be defiled. So he said to them, are you thus without understanding also? Are you just like these other Pharisees? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside, it cannot defile him? Now, I didn't say that it was all right to eat pork. Peter said, never have I eaten pork, Lord, when the sheet came down. But I'm saying that occasionally something like that may happen, but it won't kill you. But you don't want to do it as a rule. Because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated out to the draft. And he said, what comes out of a man, that's what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart, out of the mind, out of the person's personality or being, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within, and that's what defiles a man. And that's what Christ was trying to tell the Pharisees. He said, look, go and clean up your hearts and your minds, follow the spiritual precepts of the law, and develop the righteous character. But no, they wanted to look good on the outside, and that's unfortunately the way a lot of people in God's church are. Oh, they'll put forth a good show, and they want to look good. They want to make sure that they impress everyone. And what I found out through the years, one of the things they want to do is particularly impress the ministry. And what they don't realize is that they're not really impressing the ministry. What they're doing is showing true colors. Because over a process of time, God's ministry comes to be able to perceive certain things. You be able to see certain things in people, their tendencies, and the way they act. So it's not to please the ministry. It's not to please any man. But let's go back to 1 Samuel 16. 1 Samuel 16, as you're turning back there, God was going to replace Saul. And he sent Samuel to, verse 6, he sent Samuel to pick his replacement. So he sent him to Jesse. Jesse, who had some sons, and he was going to pick one of Jesse's sons to replace Saul. And so Jesse started parading all of his sons before Samuel. And let's pick up the story in verse 6. So it was, when they came, that he looked on Eliab, and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him, because he must have looked good. Yet the scriptures say that David was a handsome man, and apparently these brothers were too. And he may have been stout, he may have been, have a good physique, may have been handsome, may have looked good. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. He looks at what comes out of the heart. So in this particular case, if you continue reading on, they asked, do you have any more sons? Well, yeah, I got one more. A little run out here watching the sheep. You don't want to see him. He said, well, bring him out here anyway. Well, it ended up that was David. And that's the way God picked him and chose him. Well, let's go look at another example over in John 18. John the 18th chapter. So, the lesson we learn from the cup is that we want to make sure our heart is clean and pure before God. Now, when we come to John the 18th chapter, in verse 1, after Jesus had met with his disciples, and this is Passover evening, the evening before he was to die later on that afternoon, but he had met with them, and he had a meal with them, and he had, in John the 13th chapter, he had performed and introduced the foot washing ceremony, which the Church of God does every year. And he instituted the bread and the wine. He passed the cup around and he says, drink, for this is new covenant from my blood. And he said, eat the bread, which was unleavened bread, because it was his broken body for us. And then they sung a hymn, and then he went out into the Garden of Gethsemane. He wanted to go out there and pray. So let's pick it up in verse 1:18. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who had betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. It must have been a place that he liked to go and spend some time and rest and recuperate, and was quiet and silent, and maybe he looked at nature around him in a beautiful garden and would be able to communicate with God. And so Judas knew where he was going. So then Judas had received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. They came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" And they answered him, "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said to them, "I am he." Well, you know, in the Old Testament, when he said, "Who shall we say that you are?" he said, "Well, tell them that I am that I am." So when he said, "I am," then they fell away backwards. And Judas, who had betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth," after they got over the shock of what he said. Jesus answered, "I've told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way." He said, "If you're after me, let my friends go, that the saying might be fulfilled, which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, thinking that it's time to start the coup, it's time to declare war against the Romans, he said, "Man, we're ready." Well, he pulled out his mighty sword, and he struck off the high priest's ear, his name was Malchus. Well, that's not what Christ had it intended at all. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" Well, what did he mean? When you go back to verse 4, it says, Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" So Christ knew why he had come to this earth. He knew what lay ahead. He knew that he had responsibilities that he had to take care of. He knew what he had to do. So he says, he had to come to this earth and be born as a human being. In order to be born as a human being, so that he would know what it was like to be a human. And the blood had to be shed, and being a spirit, he couldn't shed blood because spirits don't have blood. So he had to be a human being that was worth the sum total of all humans, the one who created them, in order to die for them. So Christ knew that. Now, he didn't want to do it. Several times he said, "Father, if there's any way possible, take this cup from me." But the Father, no doubt, responded to him and said, "Son, there is no other way. It has to be this way." And so finally he said, "Well, Father, not my will, but your will be done." He had to come to this earth, and he had to preach the gospel, as we read in Mark 1, verses 14 and 15. And he had to teach his apostles what the gospel was all about the kingdom of God. And he had to spend some time with them, 3.5 years, teaching them and instructing them and preparing them to go into the whole world to preach the good news. and inspiring them later on to write the New Testament so that it would be for those who would come afterwards. He said in Matthew 16 and verse 18, I will build my church. So Christ knew that he had to build his church, because the church was actually the congregation that was going to one day purify themselves, clean up their garments, and they were going to marry Christ. So he had to prepare a people for the time that Christ would return, as we read in Matthew 19, and he was going to marry his church. So he had to begin it. So he says, I will build my church on this rock. And we read in Ephesians 2, verse 20, that rock was the cornerstone, and he built it upon what the prophets had taught, that at least those that had God's Spirit, and those who, most of them had written the books of the Old Testament. They all were the same mind. They understood God's kingdom. They understood what it was about. How much they knew, I don't know, but they had to have known enough that they died in faith and not having received the promises. So something motivated and inspired them. And now he has to build his church, which no longer he has the church in the wilderness, which was the nation of Israel, which was physical. Now he was going to introduce and begin a spiritual church, those that were filled with God's Holy Spirit. So in order for that Spirit to come back, he had to die. So he had to do these things. He had to suffer and die, and he had to lay in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights before the Father resurrected him. And once he was resurrected on the 3rd day, he had to ascend to the throne of God to become our high priest. That was the cup that the Father gave him. And he did all of that. And then finally, after completing everything, after he said, it's all finished, I've done it all, then he had to die, which was the final act here on earth. But he's not finished working yet, because he sits at the right hand of the Father right now in our behalf. So you see, that is the cup, taking the definition of the contents of the cup, the contents of his life, everything encapsulated in what Christ had to do while he was here on this earth. His cup, he had to drink it. He had to do what the Father had given him to do. So he said, shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? So he knew what he had to do the rest of that night. And then later on in the afternoon, the next day, he had to complete his assignment. Now let's try one more over in Revelation, the 15th chapter. Revelation 15. Revelation 15. You know, I said earlier that there's all different sizes and shapes of cups. And sometimes you can even consider a cup to be a bowl, because you can pour contents in that. You can mix things up, and I've known, I guess some of the people back in the Roman days, they probably drank their wine out of a bowl. The more they could get in. That reminds me too, as I went through that thrift store the other day, I saw something very, very unique. It had a bottle of wine, and made into the top of the wine, it had a stem came up and had a cup right on top of it. So the cup never run out. You just kept drinking and it kept coming out. And I said, well, I don't think I need that, but I thought it was an interesting cup. I know some people that I might could buy that for, but we won't mention any names. And I'm kidding. At any rate, let's go over to Revelation, the 15th chapter, and look at a different cup. This is a big cup. And let's begin reading in verse 1. Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues. For in them the wrath of God is complete. So once we come to understand the basic symbolism that's found in the book of Revelation, and I went over the white horse, the red horse, the pale horse, and the black horse. Well, it also talks about these plagues and these bowls. we understand that the seventh seal that Christ received from his Father, as he opened those seals, the white horse, the red horse, the black horse, the pale horse, and he opened the sixth seal, which was heavenly signs, and then he came to the seventh seal and he opened it up, and that was 7 plagues. There were 7 plagues that were to be poured out, and in the seventh of those 7 plagues, it was to be 7 more. So we come to the plagues, which are the wrath of God. And I saw something like a sea of glass. Now he's digressing a little bit, and he's talking about a sea of glass. Well, God's throne is on the sea of glass, and in Revelation, God is revealing to him this sea of glass is mingled with fire, and those who have the victory over the beast, over his image and over his mark and over the number of his name, they're standing on the sea of glass, having harps of God. Now we know in Zechariah the 14th chapter that Christ is coming back to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is going to split in two, and over that is going to be a throne, and it's going to be God's throne. And we read in other places in the book of Revelation that God's throne is like a sea of glass. So we see these people that have gotten the victory over the beast and over the image and over the number, that they're going to be there with Christ when Christ returns. So he in vision sees this. And they sing a song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying. Now, we know that Moses, the song of Moses is a reference to their deliverance from Egyptian bondage, specifically from Pharaoh's army. So they sang a song there. And now we're going to sing a new song, it says, to the Lord. It says, great and marvelous are your works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the saints. The saints are those that are going to be on the sea of glass with Christ when he returns. Who shall not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. For all nations shall come and worship before you, for your judgments have been manifested. So God is going to have to bring, one way or another, all nations before him. There won't be any rebels. There won't be any communists. There won't be any socialists. There won't be any democracies in God's kingdom. There will be one nation under God, and it will last forever. And all these nations are going to have to be subdued. There are going to be people, as we get closer to Christ's return, we understand that the Great Tribulation is the 5th seal, and God's people are the ones that are going to suffer through that. And then those that come through on the other side, those in the 144,000 and a great innumerable multitude, they're going to receive God's Spirit at that time. But then later on, there's still going to be a group of people that will not embrace God's way. And God is going to have to get their attention. And he's going to do it. After these things I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. And out of the temple came the 7 angels, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen, and having their chests girded with golden bands. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave the 7 angels 7 golden bowls, or cups, full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. The temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no one was able to enter the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. So they were going to pour out God's wrath upon those who refused to obey God. Now I'll just quickly go through. The first bowl was poured out. It was loathsome sores that came upon the people. The second bowl, the sea turns to blood. What do you think would happen when the sea turns to blood? They had a red tide down in the Gulf of Mexico not long ago, and all these thousands of fish washed up on the beach. What's going to happen when it turns to blood? I don't think fish can breathe underwater with blood. They can with the water through the gills, but they're not going to be able to breathe with the blood. The third bowl that was poured out, the waters turned to blood. The fourth bowl, men are scorched. The fifth bowl, darkness and pain. The sixth bowl, Euphrates dried up. And this great army was supposed to come across, opening the way to the kings of the east. That's a different story. And then we come to the seventh bowl. And I'm going to begin reading there in verse 17. The seventh bowl, the earth utterly shaken. Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, "It's done." You see, once that seventh bowl is poured out upon mankind, God has done it. Now you can go back to Zechariah the 14th chapter, and you begin to see, as you read on down through, and I don't know the exact verse, but it's Zechariah 14, where God's plagues, it says, their flesh just melts right off the bodies, and their eye sockets just melts out. So when God deals with people who won't listen to Him, He has a way of getting their attention. Now, He will put them to death. They will die as He pours His wrath out on them. And there were noises and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake. We also understand that Christ's return is going to be a great earthquake, and the Mount of Olives is going to split in two. So you begin to look at some of these similarities that take place at the same time. And a mighty and great earthquake, as had not occurred since men were on the earth. Now the great city was divided into the three parts. Well, that's Jerusalem. And the cities of the nations fell. There's no nation can stand under God's wrath. Not a one. They use every weapon that's ever been devised. All the nuclear weapons they'll throw at Him. But it means nothing. God's Spirit. And He's not going to be affected one way or the other by it. And the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon was remembered before God. God remembered what Babylon, this mystery religion, has done. Now, people have been deceived through the years. To give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of His wrath. He will bring it to nothing. All that man has created, all the things that they've done, these giant skyscrapers. And I watched the other day on September the 11th as they did a memorial. And I watched those two twin towers as they began to fall to the earth. And you can just imagine, that was only not even a small sample of what's going to happen to the cities around the world when God's wrath is poured out upon them. The infrastructures are going to be destroyed. And we just read about some of the things that God is going to do and how He's going to destroy the things on the earth, the waters, the plants and the vegetables and the fruits and the animals are going to be destroyed. There's not going to be any way to live without God's help. So then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. And great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. That's pretty heavy. 75 pounds where I read. Men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since that plague was exceedingly great. And so we see that in this particular case, the bowls were symbolically holding God's wrath, and they began to pour it out, and it began to inflict God's wrath upon those who would not obey God. And it says even with that, they gnawed their tongue and they cursed God up until they died. Now, ultimately, we understand that the great white throne judgment will come at the end of the millennium, and those people will be given another chance. One more chance, one more opportunity to obey God. And then if they don't, then God will destroy them forever. So, I guess some of the analogies that we can learn from this is, we can ask ourselves, is your cup the life that you're living? Is your cup filled with peace, joy, happiness, and contentment? Does your cup run over in God's church? Or is your cup half full? Or maybe even half empty? How do you look at that cup? Well, it says pick up your cross and follow me. So as Christ says, I must drink the cup that my Father gave me. Once we are immersed into that watery grave and we have God's Spirit into our minds, we've got to drink the cup, whatever it contains, whatever's in it. We've got to drink it because that's what God has planned for us. So we have to drink that cup just as He did. But in the process, we have to ask ourselves, when we look at our cup, is it just clean on the outside, or is it clean on the inside as well? Because that makes all the difference in the world. The Bible uses symbolism. Today I wanted to take one example of how God uses symbolism to teach us and to inspire us. It's just one of the methods that God has chosen to help us to understand His Word. One of these days, those people that want to argue about scriptures that they know nothing about will have their minds opened up, and they will too will be able to come to understand what God's plan of salvation is all about. And they will be able to drink from their cup, and I hope that it's clean on the inside.